And good morning, fellas. Here we
Good
are,
morning.
7 o'clock. Well, a little 7:03, but here we are back again looking at John's Gospel, and we're in chapter 6. It's been quite an eventful chapter to look at. We're getting towards the end. We're not quite there yet. I've been working ahead, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we dive into it, as far as we wrap up this chapter. But just a refresher from last week, um, we took one verse last week, verse 59, where uh, John, the writer, states that this all took place, or a portion of this interchange between Jesus and the crowd and now the disciples, took place within the context of a synagogue. And so we kind of camped on that one last week. We talked about synagogue and the role of synagogue, which is the key element, the focal point within all synagogues is the Torah scroll. Each synagogue has a handwritten copy of the Torah scroll by a scribe, and that is the focal point within our Protestant denomination. I think everybody here is Protestant generally, unless you were more in a high church. The focal point within the church is the pulpit, because we're word Bible oriented in our thinking, and so the pulpit is front and center because we're there to listen to the scriptures taught. That's not true in a Catholic church, where the pulpit is off to the one side and the altar is in the center, because the focal point there is the Eucharist, the Mass. So, we all got our focal points. So, in the synagogue, the Torah scroll is the focal point, and then so after if you attend synagogue week after week, year after year, decade after decade, just like you and I become very and we anticipate what's going to happen in this context. And so there is an anticipation of a prescribed order. We go to church, and as we go to church, we have a prescribed order of what we anticipate. And then there's participation within that prescribed order. And then we're reinforced by that, through that participation, that we're all doing the right thing. It was a good event and all that. So, and it just reinforces itself. So that was what the new first century participants here would have expected going to synagogue, and similar to our experience in our places of worship. So what makes this interesting is that we put ourselves there, that these folks are entering this synagogue in Capernaum, which is not their home synagogue, but they would be able to identify where the Torah scroll was. It would be like, in some sense, visiting a McDonald's drive-in in Tokyo, for instance. Never done that, but my assumption is that you'd feel like you were inside of a structure that could be virtually anywhere in the world, because there's a familiarity in that place, because they're all the same. And of course, I'm just speaking. I'm not speaking that out of experience, but I assume that would be true if you would visit such a place in Tokyo. So Jesus, though, induces disorder into this prescribed order. He puts this whole thing on tilt here. And we talked about that last week. And as a result, there is no reinforcement of the prescribed order, but actually what this interchange has occurred or created is a perplexing and troubling state of mind for the participants. They are in a state of mental disarray, or mental disorder is what is what we're observing here. And then as we move on to verse 60 today, this mental state of disorder is actually now involving the disciples, not just the crowd, but the disciples. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. So as we read 60 through 63, would somebody read that either on the screen or from your Bible in front of you? Let's just read these 4 verses here.
So then many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, "This statement is very unpleasant. Who can listen to it?" But Jesus, aware that his disciples were complaining about this, said to them, "Is this offensive to you? What then, if you see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh provides no benefit. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and are life."
Okay, Jeff, we could barely hear you, but
Oh, sorry.
yeah, but we got it. And I just want to call a timeout here. And through years and years of reading the Bible, and this is a pretty good example. We become accustomed to the language used, but it is in no way anywhere near how we talk in our day to day. And so the role of interpretation and trying to understand is not so much what he's saying, but in this case, Jesus, what he is saying, but primarily we should be asking, what is he doing? What is he doing? So in verse 60, many of the disciples, when they heard this, said, "This statement is very unpleasant. Who can listen to this?" We get that. That's very clear. And we also get clearly the connection to verse 61. Jesus, Jesus being aware of this, then raises this question, which we'll talk about. We can understand that very clearly, that connection. Verse 62, we also get, at least maybe a little less obvious, but we don't understand the implications of verse 62 right off the get-go, but we understand what Jesus is trying to do. He's trying to make a point here in verse 62. So he's moving from the question to the point, but then in verse 63, that is enigmatic. Where is this coming from? Now, we have become accustomed to these disjointed statements. We read the Gospels, we read Paul, and we've become accustomed to that. Well, that's Bible language. But the role of what we're trying to do every week as we go through this is try to understand what Jesus is doing, and at first, and then understanding what he's saying secondly. So I just wanted to point that out before we move on. So I'm calling this tipping point. This is the tipping point of the disciples. They're on, using the old pinball term, they're tilt. They're on tilt here. Many of the disciples, when they heard this, said, "This is very unpleasant. Who can listen to it?" So the grumbling crowd, verse 41, now becomes the grumbling disciples. That is very important. The grumbling that we see occurs because Jesus has induced disorder into their commonly held and prescribed systems of belief. From this, we can derive that the resistance to what Jesus is saying is not an isolated crowd-only issue, but rather extends to those who follow Jesus as well. So this is not a dull crowd-only issue. This has now, this grumbling, this sense of perplexity has now moved to his team. Mike, they don't get this. Mike, that is important.
Is that very unpleasant a understatement or a proper translation? It seems like someone's trying to be polite.
Bill, I can't hear you. Can the other guys hear? Can you guys hear? I'm having a hard time hearing.
Okay, well, Mike,
I can hear
that statement, very unpleasant. I mean, the interpreters, were they trying to be polite? Is that a correct translation? Is that understating the response?
Well, it's if we were to go through and read different translations, it's basically saying that this is hard to hear.
Okay.
That's how it's, I think, the King James translation. This is tough. So tough that in verse 61, we're going to see Jesus is perceiving that they're offended. They're actually offended by what he's saying. And that's the intensity of what we're looking at here. And of course, I'm using the word grumbling because that's tied in here, because it ties back to the original story in the Passover, which is the backdrop of what this whole chapter has been about. So now we've got, we had the grumbling folks in the wilderness, we got the grumbling crowd, and now we got the grumbling disciples. And through the observation, we see that faith is a process. I think this is important. We're under the notion, some of us, that we come to faith and the light, I once was blind and now I see. I don't argue that. But what we see in the Gospels and those following Jesus is faith as a process. There are moments of expressions of faith, but even up to and through the crucifixion, there were lots of doubts. Peter was the one, the denial, denied Jesus on the night when Jesus most needed his disciples. There was a scattering. So faith is a process. Both new seekers and intimate followers demonstrate resistance. And I'm looking at resistance as the barrier to faith, because I've tied those two words together. But we see it demonstrated by both seekers and the followers, this resistance towards the words of life, verse 63. So I think these are important observations. In addition, it becomes clear at this point in our story that Jesus's primary objective is not to grow the ministry. We also, and I don't know how the we is, let's talk about me. My notion is to grow the ministry, that he would grow the ministry. He's tooling around Judea and Galilee, trying to recruit people to follow him. That is how I think naturally. He's trying to grow the ministry. Why else would he have 12 and then the 70 and then, and then the growing of the ministry? Well, I question that. He's not, nor is he fearful of losing those who have been following. He's going to ask them, are you going to go too? There is absolutely no apologetic clarification or attempt to coach his disciples back into a state of mental comfort. He is not about, we don't see Jesus white knuckling, trying to get people to join the team. He says, you're welcome to come, but the qualification, you got to pick up your cross. I think this is so critical in casting the overall context of the gospel. Rather, his exclusive mandate is to do all that the Father is doing. And what the Father is doing is extending his relational union through Jesus to all who will believe. Through receiving his offer, new life occurs, beginning, as we've stated many times, in the now. It begins now. Okay, so what he does, Jesus, aware that his disciples were complaining about this, said to them, "Is this offensive to you?" Jesus engages dialogue through the use of the question. He's using a question to draw out his disciples. And I'd like to camp on this for a few minutes. Let's talk about this. He's perceiving that they are offended by what he's teaching, which is primarily about ingesting the true food and the true drink. So let's talk about this for a minute. And, what can we learn? First of all, let's talk about what can we learn here from what Jesus is not doing or saying. And I've kind of prepped you as far as what my thinking has been, but can anybody take a stab at this? What can we learn from what Jesus is not doing or saying? It's not a trick question. It's designed to bring out some discussion here.
Well, I think for me, and I've learned this more as I've gone, is that Jesus is not saying this is going to be easy. Accept what I've told you, and accept me as your savior, and life is going to be peachy keen. You're not going to have any problems. This is
Yeah.
going to be an easy road following me. He's not saying that.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess that kind of corresponds with what my thinking has been, Jeff, in regard to he has no fear of trying to re-explain himself. Well, what I really mean is this, he's not afraid of losing people here. And of course, we got to ask, why is that? What do you think's behind that?
Well, maybe he's setting them up because later on he says, you're going to get persecuted because they persecuted me.
Yeah.
So heads up, this is not necessarily an easy road.
I think that's true. Any other comments?
I was kind of, as I'm reading this, I'm hearing, maybe because I'm watching this series about Jesus on TV, The Chosen or whatever. I kind of heard him in a New York sarcastic voice when he was talking to these disciples. It's like, this offends you? Are you kidding? We haven't even started yet.
Yeah.
This, it's like a checkup. It's like, he's teaching and he's explaining things, and then he looks at him and they're muttering and murmuring and disputing. And it's like, what the heck, guys? This offends you?
Yeah.
I haven't even told you anything yet.
That's good.
Wait,
And
there's
that
more
really
to come.
what are you thinking is I can in that New Jersey accent kind of thing, and that really
Right.
ties what you just said ties in well with verse 62. That's how I understand verse 62. And Bill is raising his finger. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I wonder if Jesus is genuinely surprised about this. I mean, we have those things happening elsewhere because he gets, where's your faith? Or he was amazed at their lack of faith in other parts of the Bible. I wonder if Jesus, in a way, I wonder if Jesus is learning something too.
Huh.
Slow
What?
down.
You guys are offended by this? We got to sit down and talk about this, that's the feeling I get.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah.
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 Am I going too fast for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
All
thought that came to me was he's not fearing man, he's fearing God.
What was that again, Dick?
Well, I think sometimes we use kind of a filter and think about, are we going to offend some person by what we say? And that's a fear of man. And
Yeah.
I'm saying that he's not fearing man.
Oh, yes.
He's
Good.
fearing God.
Yeah, that's okay.
And sometimes I pray that our pastors aren't fearful of what they're going to say because they might lose some people that are actually contributing to the coffers, and they put them in financial difficulty if they offend them. So that's my thought. He just
Yeah.
doesn't fear man.
Yeah, I think that again really lines up with what we're all saying, is that, you know, his motivation is elsewhere. He's not afraid. His primary intent is not to build numbers, and his primary intent is not to soften what he's trying or change what he's trying to accommodate, so make it easier for people. And he's not being offensive, but it's being perceived in this case as offense. So
Can I be heretical here?
yeah.
Okay. When Jesus gets to the cross and God withdraws from him and he sits there and says, my God, why did you forsake me?
Yeah.
And then later you get in Hebrews, it says Jesus learned stuff. I mean, it said he learned through suffering, and he was being educated as well as everyone else. I wonder if up until that point, he has such a close relationship with his Lord that when these people don't get it, he really doesn't understand that. That, you know, he's constantly having to stop and say, you know, we're not seeing this from the same side, and he's got to remind himself of that almost. I don't know if that fits in or not.
That ties it. That is a great question and a great observation, Bill. And there, you know, the jury is out on that whole thing, because, you know, we work so hard to us as evangelicals, Protestants. We have spent a lot of brain time in our decades of belief trying to bolster up the idea that Jesus is God. Well, what you're hitting on is something different, because the Bible also says he learned through the things that he suffered. Jesus did go through a learning process, but how to put those two together, you know, the hypostatic union is what we're talking about. God, fully God and fully man. That, you know, these are all very good questions. But when he yelled that out from the cross, it was out of a sense of deep sorrow and grief and abandonment. What else would it wasn't a game by any means. So yeah. You're hitting on what does that mean? And that's a great question. Yeah. Secondly, what does this teach us about how Jesus views his ministry? And again, you're kind of I'm kind of following up on how I was thinking. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. I'm more interested in what you guys are thinking. But how would you respond to that question? What does this teach us about how Jesus views his ministry?
Well, I think what Dick said kind of rings true to me. His ministry is to represent the Father.
Yeah.
And he doesn't care who he offends when he does that. He is not out there to say things that are easy for people to hear, because, you know, it says there'll be false teachers later on that tickle your ears and say what you want to hear. And that's not his ministry. His ministry is to represent the Father, who has no lies in him, who is complete truth. And that to me is his ministry, and he sees it that way.
Yeah. You know, what really gets me about this, Jeff, is I agree 100% with what you're saying. But everything I have read, or we have read thus far, at least from my set of eyes, is Jesus's offering is a free, unattached, no hoops to jump through, no religious duties to do. All you have to do is believe. And it's that message in itself that is met by resistance. And I'm asking the question, why? You know, why is that? And I think it tells everything about where we are as human beings. And fascinating question and thing to think about. Any other comments on that?
I would say that he's just, for lack of a better term, speaking the truth and let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah.
So Mike, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Dick.
Excuse me, John. Well, your last question, I know for me, being in a weak position, which sometimes doing nothing appears to be a weak position, I would rather be, tell me what to do. You know, do I
Yeah.
have to crawl up these stairs on my knees? I'll do
Yeah.
that, you know?
Yeah.
And you feel like you're more a part of the experience of success. You know, I've done this, and I deserve the benefit because I've done what you asked. But when you're not asked to do anything, I'm going to do all this for you. Just believe it.
Yeah.
It's almost not satisfying. It's like, well, give me something to do, for goodness sakes.
Yeah.
And it's not that the disciples weren't doing anything, because they certainly, politically, they were putting their lives on the line. But in answer to your question about why are people so dissatisfied with just believing and wanting instead to do something, I think that satisfies the human nature. You know, I have some tangible action
Yeah.
that you asked me to do. I did it. What a good boy am I, kind of thing.
It creates a measuring tape, something
Exactly.
to measure. I can then be measured by this criteria that is self generated or
Right.
system generated, because then I can evaluate whether I'm doing good or not. I mean, I think that's very much part of our psyche, and part of this whole ego thing.
Mike,
Yeah,
I would be cautious to take this lesson and then put these words in the mouths of contemporary preachers. We're saying, oh, they're not teaching us the hard stuff. Well, sometimes the hard stuff is a function of what we want to hear. I mean, once you get in the moderns, the hard stuff becomes a matter of what tribe you're in. And are they preaching to you or against you or not? Well, come on, be straight, because you're going to lose some. I hate, Jesus has the authority to do that. I'm not too comfortable sometimes with down the line.
yeah. Yeah, and here, Bill, you kind of bring up that, what we were talking about is, the hard stuff is actually, from all apparent, is very easy stuff, what he's asking them to do. But the resistance he's hearing is just phenomenal.
Well, he kind of explains to eat the flesh and drink the blood, and explains it away by saying the words are spirit and not flesh. So it kind of takes them off the physical hook here.
Yeah.
So
John, you had a comment.
Mike, I was just going to say that I think the theme running through John has been to believe, right? This just keeps, believe, believe, believe. And it's like Jesus has taken everyone to the edge of their lives, the edge of their worlds, and used the word, I think, disorder. I like the word disruption, right?
Yeah.
So he took whatever their faith was up to that point and just kind of dropped the bomb on it and said, now what? Now what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And, will you believe now? And so the whole thing seems to be driving past their comfort level, whether it be Nicodemus,
Yeah.
whether it be the woman at the well,
Yeah.
just everybody. He just takes them out of their little comfort world and says, okay, are you ready to listen now?
Yeah.
Right? Do you have ears to hear? Here we go. And then, like Bill said, he gave the answer about the spirit. But anyway, I think Jesus is not at all worried about being offensive. Remember, the rich young ruler comes to him and says, what must I do? And he says, go sell everything. And it wasn't like he ever chases after people the please come with me, right?
Yeah.
He just kind of puts it out there.
Yeah. And let me throw this back at you. My comment to that is, I agree with you 100%, but I don't feel Jesus is attempting to be offensive. He's not cocky at all. I believe everything I'm seeing is out of the absolute care. Well, it's out of absolute union with his Father. And that would be motivated out of pure love towards whoever he's speaking with at the time. I don't know, what do you think of that, John?
A couple verses come to mind where he actually goes on the offensive. Was trying to find it quickly. You know, do you take offense in that? And I'm not sure. Of course, I won't find it, but I'll just stay with you.
Okay.
So, yeah, I don't think Jesus had any trouble being offensive sometimes, in a good sense, right? Just the idea to shake somebody's faith up.
Yeah.
Um,
I think maybe to cast it this way, I know that a good portion of my life, and it still creeps up quite frequently, is a high need inside of me to be right. To be right. You know, I certainly don't want to be wrong. And that can really, I'm learning that's really a lot driven by ego. And but I don't see Jesus walking around in his example with a high need to be right. His high need is to do what the Father is doing. You know, that's where he's coming from.
Yeah, Matthew 11:6 says, "And blessed is he who keeps from stumbling over me." And that can be translated from taking offense at me. Blessed is he, you know, who keeps from taking offense at me. And I think that pops up a couple times. It's more than once, but I think to a lot of people, Jesus was offensive.
Yeah. I think we've seen it thus far.
I think he's loving here, though. I mean, you're talking, John. I think those things where he pushes his offensive. That seems to be more often when he hooks it with the religious leaders. He'll push them. I don't think he's trying to push his disciples away. He's just being frank.
Right.
Yeah,
I agree.
We're going to move on to the next slide. And what I'm going to do here, guys, I'm having a really hard time hearing this morning. And I'm wondering if it's how I set this up. So bear with me. I'm going to stop the share and then I'm going to restart it. Wow. That in itself made a difference. Amazing. I changed the, wow, even that made a difference. What I'm doing is redoing the setting of the share. There. Could somebody say something?
Can you hear me okay? Bill.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, this is much. I was having a real struggle hearing you guys talk, and I kept going like this to the screen. But it has to do with sharing of the sound on the. That's amazing. Sharing of the sound with the when I share my iPad screen. So I learned a lot here.
Mike, is this a Zoom that you purchased, or is you still using the free Zoom?
No, I've got a subscription.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, let's move on. That was a good learning thing there. I can hear you guys much better now. So verse 62, and I think Vince was the first to allude to this, giving his New Jersey, picturing a cabbie in New Jersey or in New York. What then if you see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? Okay, this is the follow-up of the question. And my comments, after using the question to engage his disciples, notice he's moving towards, there's a resistance and Jesus is moving towards. That is critical. my first response is always in resistance is to pull away. Jesus engages his disciples. He continues by drawing them, his disciples, from their current mental state, which is perplexing frustration, to the much larger reality. And it's the throne room reality of Daniel chapter 7, 13 and 14. So from my belief, guys, every time he uses that term son of man, somewhere in there is the reference to the throne room in Daniel 7. In so doing, he directs the conversation from what's called the lesser to the greater. And this is actually, there's a word for this, aphatori or something like that. It's a method of argument. This means that the invitation to ingest the true food and the true drink is merely a subset of a much larger reality that exists beyond their current grasp. And I thought of a story. It's it's kind of humbling. I may have told this story, but the first time I ever rented a car that didn't have a key, it had a push button start. I was at the airport, and I was in Milwaukee, and I was driving out. It was a Generac meeting, and so I got this car in the evening, and I got in the car, and I somehow I pushed the button and it started. You carry this key with you. It's not a key you insert. It's just, probably a lot of you guys have push button start cars. Well, I didn't know how it started. I know I pushed the button, but I struggled with getting it started. I pushed the button a couple times and it didn't start. And then all of a sudden I pushed it again and it started. And I didn't know why it started. And so I was struggling with this whole key thing. And I got out to the hotel, which is about a 40-minute drive out near Waukesha, a suburb, and went into the hotel and talked to this woman behind the desk. Her name was Mavis. And she says, well, Mr. Hatter, how was your trip? And I says, oh, man, it was a great trip and all that, but I don't know how I got here. And she laughed and she goes, what do you mean? I said, well, I got this push button car and I've never had one before. And I don't know how to start this. And I've got to be out at the Generac headquarters tomorrow morning at 7:30. And I don't know how to start that car. And she thought that was the funniest thing ever. And she said, well, we'll get you checked in and we'll take you out there. We'll go out and kind of walk through it. And I opened the door for her and she sat down there and boom, started right up. I go, well, what did you do? And she said, well, you got to have your foot on the brake. And you guys probably know that. And of course, I know that by now. And so here my correlation very remotely is here, you got to know how to start the car before you can drive the car. And that is, in a sense, the bigger reality is the drive, the trip, the throne room reality. But, guys, to his disciples is, you got to know how to start the car. So that was my little analogy of learning how to drive a push button car.
Yeah, Mike, to me, it takes me back to my academy days when I go into the math class and the guy starts explaining stuff and I'm not getting it. And he's like, if you don't get this,
yeah,
you're not going to get the rest of this.
Right. Yeah.
You're going to struggle the rest of the time you're here with not only this math class, but the ones to follow.
That's
and
a better.
What Jesus is saying, he said, guys, if you don't get this, what I'm telling you next or what you're going to see next is going to blow your mind and you're not going to get it.
That's a much better analogy, is the idea that this guys in your math class, this is a subset right now. We are in a subset of a much larger reality. You've got to get this before you can increment on to the next step. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing, from the lesser to the greater. So note also, I think John referenced this a little bit ago with Nicodemus. The same argument, Jesus is doing the same thing in John 3:12-14, where he reframes two Old Testament stories back to back. The first one is the ascending and descending, Jacob's ladder, where he says the Son of Man is going to be ascending and descending. He reframes that Old Testament story to now include the Son of Man. And then right in verse 14, he uses the Moses in the wilderness with the staff of the serpent. And he says the Son of Man must be raised up. So there he's equating two very common Old Testament stories, one with Jacob and one with Moses, two patriarchs, and tying to the Son of Man. Same thing. He's pointing to the larger, the more comprehensive reality. And he did that in chapter 3 as he did this here in chapter 6. Verse 63 says, it is the Spirit. Now here's where what I introduced at the get-go is, okay, what does this mean? Well, let's take a look at it. It's the Spirit who gives life. The flesh provides no benefit. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and are life. So here's my comments. I think it's a clear, decisive move towards explanation. Verse 63 is an explanation of what he has stated before. Jesus now calls out and contrasts two sources from which inform thinking and action. Now, this is tying back to what we talked about a few weeks ago, and you'll see the correlation. Here it is. Source 1 in verse 63 is the words spirit that lead to life. That is source 1. Source 2 is the flesh, which leads to no benefit. And I've got a qualifier from within this context. Now, just want to sit on this for a minute. I have spent a great deal of my Christian life, in more later years of really thinking, when the flesh is mentioned in the New Testament, what's he talking about? What's the flesh? Because the common notion, and for a lot of years, I held the notion that the flesh is evil and the spirit is good. Now, even though I wouldn't probably state it that way, but Paul says the warring of the flesh against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh. We get this idea that the spirit is superior and the flesh is inferior. And it's the flesh that makes me do all of these things. I don't hold that view anymore. And it's still being defined, but guys, as we look at the opening verses of John's gospel, it is the eternal word that has become flesh. And that fleshness is Jesus of Nazareth. So I'm looking at, I'm again, because my binary way of thinking, good, evil. Well, I don't think he's talking about good and evil. He's not making that distinction. He's saying the spirit is the avenue of understanding. The flesh is just simply, it's not evil, but it provides no benefit in understanding. Now, so that we're going to leave that there, but I want to say that next week, I'm going to introduce actually a physical diagram, a model of each source. And at least through that model, you'll be able to understand how I'm understanding this. And then, it's up to you how you want to vote. But I'm going to go into that model. We're going to look at 63 next week, and I'll lay out these two models. So moving on here, just to finish up these thoughts, we've got two sources. The spirit brings life, and the flesh is no benefit. And I'm adding my qualifier from within this context. I do think the flesh has real benefit within other contexts. It gives us the ability to communicate, to express, to love, to do, to serve. The flesh provides us this shell that we work with to express God's love and God's concern and qualitative experiences. But in this context, no benefit. In addition, Jesus attaches his words to source one, thus identifying himself with this source. So source one is now Jesus. These are key words from the verse. Jesus, his words, which lead to spirit and life. Okay, there's kind of the flow. The source, he's just saying in this context, it provides no benefit in understanding. I think it's safe to assume that the resistance we're seeing within the story, indirectly through the grumbling in the wilderness to the Passover story, and which introduced the bread of life, directly and through the crowd who displayed resistance. And now in verse 60, the disciples who are demonstrating resistance. So this resistance, this commonality is due to this source two thinking. This should come as no surprise. Think of it as a way of processing reality, this way of thinking, processing reality. And I think we're talking about two different methodologies here. And they're not, one is bad and one is good. It's not it at all. One is natural and one is counterintuitive, I would say, that has to be learned in time. And I've already introduced this a few weeks back. This should come to no surprise because we've seen this earlier. And on the left, we've got apples. On the right, we've got oranges. And I'm using that term out of Philippians chapter 2 because I think Paul attached what we're talking about here and actually created a term called the mind of Christ. Have this mind in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. I don't think he's talking about generalities. I think he's talking about characteristics of a way of processing information and reality around us. And that I'm going to lay out a model next week that at least will describe my thinking in that. On the right-hand side, we've already introduced the binary mind. And I talked about that a few weeks ago. And I think that is our God-given, created common way of thinking, and it is very helpful. It helps us navigate through everyday life. It is necessary, but I do believe it falls short within the context that we're talking about, with the deeper realities of paradox, of mystery, of love, of death, of God. God in himself transcends binary thinking. And I think that is at the crux of what this resistance is all about. And we're going to look at that, we're going to look at those two models next week. So we got about 10 minutes and we won't go to table time because we don't have time to go discuss and come back. So we're going to do it as a big group. But I'd like last week, I know Vince let out really, really great. Vince, thank you for that response so quickly last week. But I'd like us to think about just for a minute. Can you describe a time in your life where you felt spiritually, doctrinally, theologically, church traditionally, religiously resistant, where you were in conversation with another individual and you somehow felt this resistance come up inside of you? This is a common experience to us as human beings. What was it like? What does it feel like in you? I got 3 questions. And we don't have to do this in order, but it's just what comes to mind when you think about, how does it feel in you? What do you think is driving that resistance? Boy, this is what I think about. What's driving this resistance? And I was just thinking about this yesterday. I still have a lot of ego. When I don't get the response I want, or when I'm sitting across the table from another person and they start talking about thus and so, I can feel it well up. And so I'm at this feeling, this negative feeling. What's driving that? And I think there's a lot more ego in me left than I thought there was. It still raises its head. What have you learned through this experience? Well, the very things I've been talking about is that it's not over till it's over. but the good news is maybe at our age we can start catching ourselves a bit. So I know, what are your what are your thoughts, guys? Can anybody take a stab at this?
Yeah, Mike, I've got, and it's not necessarily that I'm sitting across from somebody arguing about something spiritual, but in reading through the Old Testament, when I'm reading Exodus and Deuteronomy, and where they're given the laws, and it says, if you have a male servant, or slave or whatever, then he's, and this is all paraphrased, but he's worth 30 whatever. And then if you have a female one that you injure or whatever, then they're worth 20. And I'm going, man, what was he thinking back then? The worth of a human being versus another one, or if you have to pay back so much for a male versus a female, and it just grinds on me, because I'm thinking to myself, how do I explain this kind of thing to a non-believer? Especially in this day and age.
Yeah.
It's talking about slavery, and it's talking about male versus female, and I'm like, that I have no way right now. I don't feel the wisdom and spiritual discernment to be able to explain that to somebody that's a non-believer.
Uh-huh. Okay, that is a wonderful example. And that ties directly in to how we are supposed to be thinking about the scriptures. What that is saying, and Jeff, you are not alone. And that's a good example, is that we have always been taught that, in a sense, be your tradition, you can disagree, but the Bible is, in a sense, gives us directives of how to live our life, in a sense, a rule book. And what do you do with that rule, Jeff?
Yeah, I don't know.
and that sense of, this doesn't make sense, that in itself makes us feel guilty, because we're doubting in our heads the authoritative value of what the scriptures are supposed to be about.
Mhm.
Is that not true?
Yeah. I was at a Bible study last night with that very verse and subject came up by, to me, he was a young kid. He was probably 20 or something. And he was struggling with the whole slave thing, and how does God endorse slaves and tell you that. I said, in my opinion, he's working with the culture he's working with.
Yeah.
This is what this is the reality of the life of the readers. They had slaves. And as long as you got slaves, this is how you should treat them. And it's kind of like, it's not like he's endorsing it. And I know this, Jeff, of course, but it's what came up last night was the what do you call those guys in insurance that determine how much your car is worth, whatever they're called? Actuaries, adjusters.
Oh, yeah.
When you lose an arm, they go, well, that's worth $2,000. If you lose a foot, that's $2,500. If you top of your head gets cut off, that's about $7,000. And they're not really saying that that's what it's worth, but you got to quantify something. I mean, you can't just, the cattle on 1,000 hills. Here you go. it comes down to when you're working with people and you're working with culture, you got to put numbers on it.
Yeah.
Many times. And, that's what I think his disciples had problems with. It's like, I've been counting out Annas and Cumin my whole life. I've given you 7 and I've taken 3, and now you're telling me it doesn't matter? What the heck? I'm used to quantifying things. I'm used to counting. This is how we live our life. And now it's all, the law doesn't matter all of a sudden.
Right.
It's very strange.
Yeah. Good, Vince. Jeff, you've raised a good question here. Any other comments on this?
So
Well,
Mike,
I'm just
Go
thinking
ahead.
that, oh, go ahead, John.
now you go.
Well, I was just thinking we're in a fallen world. It was a fallen world back there. And so things weren't exactly the way the kingdom of God had not come. And we're still waiting on that. So you can understand the fact that there's inequality and things like that, because that still exists today. That's my 2 cents worth.
Yeah. Thanks, Dick. John, you got a comment?
Yeah, I mean, and I won't, just short. So I feel like this all the time, often. And so I think 2 big things play into that. So when I got diagnosed with cancer years ago and thought I didn't have long to live, and that changed everything. But then losing my wife a couple years ago, I find that I say life is short and life is fragile. So so when I visit a church, it's like I don't have time anymore for religion. And I should really say healthy religion and unhealthy religion. So I should be real careful. But the point is, it's kind of like, time out. What is this all about? What are you doing? So I feel like this being resistant often, just around religious people or, yeah. So.
Yeah. So it's something common that we all, I think it's with us. It has been with us. The ability to recognize it, though, is several steps forward. To go through life and not recognize that I am resistant is really quite sad. So anyway, let's, we're 8:01. Guys, there is so much within this gospel. I'm just having such a great time. Not an easy time because it's work, but boy, I've really enjoyed it. And next week, like I've already introduced, we're going to look at, what we have on the table is my explanation of why this resistance. And I'm identifying 2 different sources of way of processing reality. And again, I'm not labeling them. This is very important, as one is good and one is bad. They're both have their place. And next week, I've created a model that, physical diagrams of how I perceive each, and I'll submit those to you for your review next week. At least you'll be able to understand, how I'm understanding it. So have a good week, guys. And thanks for joining in. See you now.
You too. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Guys, have a great week.
Bye.
Thank you, Mike.
Yep. Bye for now.
Yeah, very good.